I've never been a superstitious or gullible person. I've always considered myself a rational and skeptical man. But what I experienced that fateful night in the old St. Mary's Church in Blackwood challenged all my concepts about the world and what I believed to be real. It was a cold, dark October night when it all began. I was driving home after a long day at work, and as usual, I decided to take a shortcut along the country roads that snaked through the empty fields. That's when I spotted the large and imposing structure of St. Mary's Church, a Gothic building of grey stone that stood like a somber monolith against the night sky. Something about that sight aroused my curiosity. I had always heard stories about that church being abandoned for decades after the last priest mysteriously disappeared. Some said the place was haunted, others that it served as a setting for dark and bloody rituals. I always dismissed these legends as nonsense, but that night, something called me to explore the place. I stopped the car by the side of the road and walked towards the church, entering through the rusty gates. A shiver ran down my spine as I stepped onto the sacred ground, as if an ominous energy was hovering in the air. I ignored this feeling and moved on, determined to uncover the secrets of the place. As I explored the church's basement, my eyes widened at the macabre scene that unfolded. Scattered across the dusty floor were human remains and bones. A foul smell of putrefaction permeated the air, making me swallow the bile that rose in my throat. Stumbling over a pile of bones, I spotted an old grimy diary lying in a corner. Consumed by morbid curiosity, I picked it up off the floor and began to leaf through its yellowed pages. What I read in those scribbled lines made my blood run cold. The diary contained terrifying accounts of a satanic cult operating within that very church, led by a former priest called Father Thomas. Graphic descriptions detail dark rituals involving human sacrifice, with victims being mutilated and dismembered in the name of some demonic entity. As I read on, my stomach churned with the gory and disturbing details. Entire pages were dedicated to describing the agonized screams of the victims while their bodies were desecrated in unspeakable ways. I should have stopped there, but the morbidity consumed me, forcing me to turn more pages of that macabre diary. A sinister creak from the upper floor snapped me out of the morbid trance in which I was immersed. Startled, I put the diary down on the floor and looked up, realizing that I was alone in that dark, fetid basement. A shiver ran down my spine when the sound was repeated, louder this time, as if something heavy was dragging upstairs. I decided it was time to get out of there. No matter how intriguing the contents of that diary were, my sanity was being eroded every minute I spent in that damned place. I rushed up the rusty stairs and emerged in the main nave of the church. The very little moonlight that penetrated through the tall stained glass windows was enough to reveal a scene that will never leave my mind. Dark, sticky stains covered the stone floor, forming a sinister trail that snaked towards a dark corner. I approached slowly, fearing what I might find. When my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I held back a scream of horror. Laid carelessly on the floor like putrefied spoil was what was left of a human body. The legs and arms had been brutally torn from the torso, leaving only bloody stumps. Its head hung to one side, its bulging eyes fixed in an expression of sheer terror. Gasping, I took a few steps back, stumbling over a pool of clotted blood. That's when I recognized the disfigured face. It was Sarah Wilkins, a young woman who had disappeared weeks ago in Blackwood. The local news had covered her disappearance exhaustively, and now I had before me the remains of that poor soul. Panic overwhelmed me. I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I ran towards the entrance doors of the church, only to find that they were locked. Pounding on the aged wood, I started shouting for help, hoping that someone would hear me. My hands beat frantically against the locked doors as I screamed for help until my throat burned. But no one was coming. The old church was isolated in the middle of nowhere, far from prying ears. I was trapped there, surrounded by the bloody remains of some grotesque act of violence. A noise behind me made me turn around abruptly. My heart practically stopped when I spotted a hooded figure sneaking into the nave of the church. She was carrying something that glinted in the dim light, a bloody knife. I swallowed, backing away from the doors as the figure slowly approached. Suddenly she stopped and raised her head, as if she had noticed me. I froze in place, feeling cold sweat trickle down my back. Then I realized something that made my stomach turn. The figure was holding what looked like a severed human arm. Running in panic, I snuck behind a pillar, peeking around the corner. The hooded figure turned its head slowly, scanning its surroundings. Then she started walking again, dragging her bare feet across the stone floor. That's when I recognized her. It was Father Thomas, the same leader of the satanic cult described in the diary. His face was hidden under the hood, but I knew it was him, moving with the same sinister, calculated posture depicted on the yellowed pages. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched in horror as Father Thomas approached the main altar. He raised his severed arm as if offering a grotesque sacrifice, and then began to chant a low guttural chant in some ancient language unknown to me. I felt a supernatural chill run down my spine as Thomas continued his bizarre ritual. The air seemed to thicken, charged with an evil, oppressive force. Shards of bluish fire began to dance on the tips of the old torches hanging on the walls, illuminating the stained glass windows with a ghostly light. As Father Thomas's macabre ritual continued, I remained hidden behind the pillar, watching with growing horror and morbid fascination. He pulled a young woman by the hair and dragged her to the altar. The poor creature struggled and screamed, begging for mercy, but Thomas was relentless. With cold, methodical movements, he tied the woman to the stone altar. Her hood slipped, revealing a wrinkled and deformed face, the deep-set eyes glowing with demonic madness. He raised the bloody knife, reciting words that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. I was unable to look away as the blade descended, opening a deep gash in the victim's neck. Blood gushed out hotly, splashing Thomas's distorted face. The woman arched her back, her screams turning into shrill squeals before finally falling silent. With almost reverent movements, Thomas began to mutilate and dismember the still warm body. Pieces of flesh and bone flew through the air, littering the hallowed ground. My mind screamed at me to run, to flee that scene of atrocity. But my legs simply wouldn't obey, paralyzed by shock and horror. Suddenly, Thomas's lifeless eyes turned in my direction. I froze, certain that I had been discovered. For an interminable moment, we stared at each other, predator and prey. Then, with an animalistic roar, he advanced towards me, knife raised above his head. Awakening from my trance, I turned and ran as fast as I could, desperately looking for a way out. Behind me, I could hear the heavy footsteps and panting breaths of Thomas, hunting me mercilessly through the dark corridors of the church. I turned a corner and came across an ajar door. Without a second thought, I threw myself through it, finding myself in a small confession room. I locked the door behind me, dragging a heavy piece of furniture to block it. On the other side, Thomas scratched and punched at the wood, his animalistic growls echoing off the stone walls. Huddled inside the small confessional, I tried to stifle my panting breaths with trembling hands. On the other side of the door, Thomas's violent scratches and punches didn't stop, as if he were a caged beast determined to get to me. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash as Thomas's full weight slammed into the door. The wooden frame shuddered, making the hinges creak dangerously. I grabbed the side seats, praying that the makeshift barrier would hold. Another violent blow, and this time the door partially gave way, opening a crack through which I saw Thomas's deformed face. His black eyes glowed with demonic fury, his mouth twisted into an animalistic grimace as he grunted and gasped. Absolute panic gripped me as the bloody bare hand reached through the opening, groping blindly towards me. Stepping back as far as I could, I spotted a metal bar lying in the corner. Without a second thought, I grabbed it tightly and began to strike furiously at those disgusting fingers that were squirming to reach me. A howl of pain cut through the air as my attacks hit their target. For a brief moment, the hand retreated. But then Thomas resumed his mad fury, slamming into the door with everything he had. It shook his distorted face, flowing out of his open mouth in a viscous river. The locks finally gave way, and the door burst open with a bang that made the stained glass windows shudder. Thomas burst into the confessional, the knife raised above his head in a deadly arc. I rolled to the side at the last second as the blade hissed through the air, slamming into the seat where I had been seconds before. I didn't have time to react when Thomas's full weight hit me, knocking me to the dusty floor. His hand squeezed my throat with superhuman strength, slowly choking me. His foaming saliva dripped down my face as he clenched his yellowed teeth, about to tear a chunk out of my flesh. Blinded by panic, my fingers groped blindly until they found a shard of glass abandoned on the floor. Without hesitation, I drove it deep into Thomas's eye. He screamed in agony, slightly loosening the pressure on my neck. Taking advantage of that split second, I gathered all my strength and pushed Thomas to the side, reversing our positions. Now I was on top, punching his disfigured face mercilessly. Pieces of skin and flesh protruded with each blow, until his features became unrecognizable, a bloody, shapeless mass. Finally, as the last vestiges of life left his twisted body, I dropped my balled fists. I rolled onto my side, gasping desperately, watching Thomas' dead, bulging eyes for any sign that this demonic creature could still revive. I dragged myself out of the confessional in a state of total shock, leaving Father Thomas's shapeless body behind. My clothes were soaked with blood, and every gasping breath made my ribs ache in agony. Staggering through the gloomy corridors, I finally found the entrance doors and managed to push them open, emerging into the cold night. The silver light of the moon illuminated my bloodied face as I looked back at the imposing facade of the old church. Clutching my cell phone with trembling hands, I dialed the emergency number and reported the horrific events that had occurred. A few minutes later, the flashing lights of the police and an ambulance cut through the darkness. Sitting in the vehicle, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of hospital disinfectant, I told my story to the incredulous authorities. Their eyebrows furrowed as I described Father Thomas's macabre rituals and the satanic cult that operated inside the abandoned church. The more I spoke, the more skeptical their countenances became. Eventually, they took me to hospital for treatment, where I was examined by a psychiatrist. He shook his head in pity when I finished my disturbing account, muttering something about extreme trauma and dissociation. That's when I realized that no one would believe me. The police probably thought it was all a figment of my disturbed imagination. What I had witnessed was so grotesque, so deeply rooted in the realm of evil, that my rational mind would never be able to process it. After medicating myself with tranquilizers, I was admitted to a psychiatric ward for observation. Sitting alone in that tiny room with its padded walls, I hugged my knees to my chest, rocking back and forth. The memories of that bloody night in the old St. Mary's Church haunted me every moment, chasing me in terrifying nightmares. Even after I was discharged months later, I could never really get over what I had experienced. I became a bitter and lonely man, constantly looking over my shoulder, fearing that the shadows of the past would one day catch up with me again. The years dragged on like endless torture after that fateful night. While the world moved on, I remained trapped in an endless cycle of nightmares and terrifying memories. The images of Father Thomas's bloody rituals were ironclad in my troubled mind. I became a hermit, avoiding human contact as much as possible. My job, my relationships, everything collapsed in the face of the psychological burden I was carrying. The only constant companions were the alcohol that dulled my senses and the drugs that failed to make the inner demons quiet. It was during these nights of solitary drinking that I allowed myself to revisit those terrifying events in the old St. Mary's Church. Part of me longed for answers, for some kind of conclusion or redemption that could bring peace to my tormented soul. Then, in a haze of alcohol and delirium, I made an impulsive decision that would change everything. I would leave Blackwood behind and return to the scene of the crime, the abandoned church that had been the stage for those atrocities so many years ago. The roads seemed to wind endlessly as I drove, their headlights cutting through the darkness of the night like spectral beams. Seeing the familiar outlines of the Gothic stone structure made my heart freeze, bringing back repressed memories in an overwhelming flood. I stepped onto the same hallowed ground again, feeling the same sinister presence that had welcomed me so many years before. This time, however, I would not be deterred. I needed to confront my demons once and for all, even if it meant consuming myself completely. The main doors were locked, so I went around the church until I found a broken window. I climbed over the old, peeling bricks and slipped inside, falling into a heap of dust and cobwebs. My torch illuminated the wreckage of what had once been the main ship. I passed pools of dried blood, scattered human bones, everything exactly as I had left it years ago. It was as if time had frozen in this damned place. I descended the creaking stairs that led underground, the flickering torchlight casting dancing shadows on the damp walls. Downstairs, I found the old leather journal again, its cover worn by time and the elements. I had barely begun to leaf through it when I heard a noise behind me. I turned slowly, my heart racing, only to be met by a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the torchlight in the darkness. Before I could react, I was knocked to the ground by an unconscionable force, my head slamming against the stone floor. Everything went dark for a moment, until I regained consciousness and realized that I was tied to a stone table. Hooded figures moved around me, chanting gutturally in an ancient language. My stomach churned as I recognized the gruff voice leading the dark rituals. It was Father Thomas. Even after all these years, the monster had somehow survived, perpetuating his demonic cult within these walls. He approached, his deformed face contorted into a grimace of sadistic triumph. His black eyes glittered as he raised the ceremonial knife above my head. My wrists and ankles were bound with rough ropes that cut into my flesh. I lay motionless on the stone altar, watching with growing horror as the hooded figures moved in a ritualistic circle around me. Guttural chants filled the air, reverberating through the damp underground walls, like voices from hell itself. A supernatural mist seemed to condense, making the air thick and stale. The smell of sulfur and putrefying flesh made me swallow the bile that rose in my throat. In the center of the circle, a young woman was dragged screaming by two muscular acolytes. Her eyes were bulging with sheer terror as they threw her to the ground at my feet. Her dress was torn, exposing horrible bruises that stained her bare skin. With an impatient gesture of his bare hand, Father Thomas ordered the henchman to bring him the victim. The poor creature screamed and struggled, begging for mercy, but his ordeals were in vain. I watched helplessly as Thomas raised his ceremonial knife, the blade gleaming with a dark radiance. Without hesitation, he plunged the blade into the woman's abdomen, tearing through her flesh. A piercing scream echoed off the stone walls as he twisted the blade, opening a bloody slit. The scream stopped abruptly when Thomas violently ripped out the still-warm entrails. His black eyes glowed with demonic ecstasy as he raised the pulsating organs above his head in a grotesque offering. Fresh blood splashed on my face as I watched, paralyzed with horror. Back in the circle, the acolytes began a new round of chanting, their voices rising in an ecstatic frenzy. Thomas joined in, his ancient and sinful words ringing with supernatural power. The whole room seemed to pulse with an evil, overwhelming force. When the frenzy reached its peak, Thomas turned to me with a look of unbridled triumph on his disfigured face. Slowly, he approached the altar, the knife raised like a death sentence. His lips twitched into a sickly smile as he leaned over, his hot, fetid breath lashing my face. "After all these decades, I will finally have the honor of offering your still beating heart," he hissed, his voice a sinister caress. "You have witnessed the deepest mysteries, and for that you must be sacrificed." My screams were muffled when Thomas stuffed a filthy rag into my mouth. Arching my back, I struggled against the restraints that held me to the altar, but it was no use. The monster bent over me, the blade descending in an inexorable trajectory towards my chest. The sharp blade pierced my flesh with sickening ease, slicing through muscle and bone like a hot knife through butter. A muffled scream of agony escaped from behind the grimy cloth stuffed in my mouth. Father Thomas's feverish eyes glowed with perverse ecstasy as he twisted the knife, opening a bloody crater in my chest. The pain was indescribable, stabbing into every nerve ending as he cut deeper, determined to extract the prize he so coveted, my still beating heart. Through a blinding red haze, I spotted the hooded acolytes crouching around the altar, their bare hands outstretched in reverent offering. Their united voices rose in a guttural chant, echoing off the stone walls in a symphony of the purest evil. The knife continued its sadistic descent, tearing chunks of flesh and muscle from my torn chest. The suffering was indescribable, transcending all limits of physical pain. My screams turned into high-pitched squeals when Thomas finally reached his goal, exposing my beating heart gasping against the cold night air. A triumphant roar erupted from the monster's deformed throat as he raised the still-living organ in his bloody hand. The acolytes howled with ecstasy, extending their filthy tongues as if yearning for a taste of that macabre reward. However, something strange began to happen. As the life drained from my dying body, the flames of the ancient torches began to flicker and waver. The dancing shadows on the walls seemed to twist and stretch, taking on a substance of their own. A supernatural chill took hold of the room, so icy that the acolyte's breath turned into clouds of condensed steam. A thunderous roar from something far beyond our earthly comprehension shook the foundations of the old church. Father Thomas froze, his face contracted into a mask of unspeakable terror. His wide eyes watched helplessly as an invisible force snatched my beating heart from his loathsome hands. The still-living organ floated in the air for a moment, bathed in a supernatural aura before simply disappearing in a cloud of thick smoke. The acolytes screamed and threw themselves to the ground, covering their hooded heads in primal fear. A guttural, formless laugh echoed off the walls, making my hair stand on end. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sinister mockery against all the laws of nature. To my blurred eyes, the shadows squirmed and wriggled, taking on grotesque and tentacular forms that seemed to go on for eternity. When my senses finally failed and the world went dark, the last thing I saw was Father Thomas's face, a mask of absolute terror and disbelief. I realized then that, however many atrocities this vile creature had committed, there were even older and more perverse forces at play. Forces he could never hope to control. My journey had come to an end, my last breath dissipating among the demonic ruins of old St. Mary's Church. But my soul would have little rest, for evil never sleeps, always accumulating its dead to fuel the infernal fires of eternal darkness.